in the Environmental Qualities Committee. We have my colleague, Bob Wachowski. Top of the morning to you. I wanted to say in the beginning, make my remarks brief because we're going to start in on this, but we all know we have a lot of work to do to meet our AB 32 goals, and since transportation does contribute 38% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the state, we need to take major steps to reduce this impact. And some of the new programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are just beginning to roll out. So it's opportune time now to check in with the California State Transportation Agency, the Cal EPA, and the California Energy Commission today to make sure we're on the same page. So I'm looking forward to this hearing from our agencies and advocates also about how the programs are working so far and whether or not we need to make any tweaks or whatever you want to call it, modifications. Most importantly, we want to make sure that the agencies are working together so that there is little or no overlap or redundancy. We need to track and analyze some of these programs and use our resources wisely in a coordinated, comprehensive strategy to reduce the impact of the transportation sector on our climate, our environment, our health. And Bob, I'd like to turn it over to you, and Bob has some opening remarks also.
Welcome. As the title of this joint hearing indicates, this is the road to 2020 and beyond. And this is the impact that the transportation sector is going to have on our climate goals and the new goals that we'll be setting. You know, the ever-growing body of scientific evidence warns us that the global community is at grave risk from these catastrophic climate change events. We've discussed many of those aspects and the state's response in an adaptation hearing that we held with the environmental quality just a few weeks ago. And from the hearing, it was clear that we face an incredible challenge from climate change. It's frighteningly apparent from the hearing that many of those climate impacts are happening right now. And in order to stave off the worst and most severe impacts of climate change, we must have even a greater commitment to greenhouse gas emissions reduction and our adaptation policy. As Senator Bell indicated, here in California, transportation is nearly 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's this sector, the transportation sector, that contributes the highest percentage of our smog-forming pollutants as well. It's clear that transportation and environmental quality are inextricably linked in addressing the greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Not only does it help us in the climate arena, but there's a huge impact on air quality and ultimately public health, especially in the areas of the state that suffer the worst air pollution and some of the highest asthma rates among our children in the nation. It's the public health that we keep coming back to. So it's imperative that we now have a wide range of regulatory and incentive programs in the transportation sector, that we look critically at how these programs will work to meet those greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Now, specifically, we want to do how have the programs and the measures been working thus far? And then how will these new programs that are funded through the cap and trade auction revenue complement the existing programs? And then what are the public health and environmental quality benefits of that these programs provide, and how will the programs help the disadvantaged community? And as we have an oversight hearing, how are we monitoring the progress that we're making? It's my hope that this joint hearing gives us a good understanding of where we are with our current suite of transportation-related programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and where we need to go in order to continue leading the nation in the fight of climate change up to 2020 and beyond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob. We want to know if any other senators have any opening remarks. Thank you. Let's go right into our panel. Our first group is talking about an overview of the environmental impacts from the transportation sector, and we have a couple of deputy secretaries I'd like to invite forward. Ashley Conrad-Seda from the Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy, California Environmental Protection Agency, and welcome Kate White, Deputy Secretary of Environmental Policy and Housing Coordination from the California State Transportation Agency. So welcome, and thank you for attending this hearing. And I think order is Ashley will be first. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman and members. I'm Ashley Conrad-Seda, Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at the California Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you to Senators Bell and Wieckowski for inviting me here to speak today. I'm speaking on behalf of our Secretary, Matt Rodriguez. He is in Washington, D.C., representing California at the Environmental Council of States meeting and speaking at a U.S. Senate hearing. So you asked Cal EPA to address 3 topics today regarding the role of the transportation sector in meeting California's climate goals. First, I'll discuss the Cal EPA's role in coordinating climate policy and ensuring environmental protection and sustainability as it relates to the transportation sector. Second, I'll discuss the way transportation sector investments improve environmental quality and public health in the state of California. And third, I'll address the role of the agency in implementing SB 535 of 2012 and how the agency works to address environmental justice issues, specifically as those issues relate to the transportation sector. I'll also discuss California's role as a leader on the road to 2020 in the transportation and climate community before my colleagues provide detail on many of our transportation and climate programs. So we take an integrated and comprehensive approach to combating climate change in all sectors of California's economy. Among others, energy, transportation, natural resources, and waste are all addressed through the suite of AB 32's complementary policies. So we use the same approach of complementary, comprehensive, and integrated strategies in the transportation sector, where issues of climate change and air quality converge, as you both said today. Transportation is the largest source of both air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in California. Our clean vehicle and fuel technologies and strategies can be used to address both of these issues. You'll hear my colleagues today talk about how we tackle transportation, climate change, and public health nexus through passenger and freight movement strategies, including increases in zero-emission vehicles, road, rail, and transit policies, and sustainable communities, infrastructure, and active transportation programs. This integrated approach lends itself to coordinated interagency work. As the Secretary noted in a previous hearing, he's the chair of the Climate Action Team, a group of agency secretaries charged with coordinating climate policy throughout our agencies and collaborating to ensure that these policies are efficient and effective, useful at the local and regional levels. As home to the CAT, or sometimes the Big Cat as we call it, Cal EPA leads and coordinates California's comprehensive climate policy approach. Together, CAT members have developed and workshopped the administration's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, investment plans, ARB's AB 32 scoping plan, OEHA's Climate Change Indicators report, the Resources Agency's Safeguarding California plan, and a host of other state-level climate policy documents. So because the CAT involves members throughout state agencies, including the Transportation Agency, Energy Commission, and Air Resources Board, all here with us today, we work to avoid duplication of effort, maximize our investments, and coordinate to make full use of our resources. Additionally, the Secretary sits on the Strategic Growth Council, which coordinates activities that support sustainable communities, emphasizing strong economies, social equity, and environmental stewardship. Among many other tasks, Secretary Rodriguez works with other council members to set guidelines for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund expenditures in the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. This program is aiming to spend $125 million this year from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund on integrated housing and transportation programs and strategies that reduce vehicle miles traveled and thus the emissions from the transportation sector that affect public health. So this is just one program included in the first Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund investment plan, and that's the plan where the administration allocated or suggested the allocation of the majority of the funds to the transportation sector. Those funds were then appropriated at 75% of the $630 million, or 75% of the total funds to be allocated for the transportation sector. And those programs include affordable housing and sustainable communities, low-carbon transit operations, transit and intercity rail capital, low-carbon transportation, and high-speed rail. And again, all of those will be discussed in detail today. So these programs, though they're focused in transportation, have the additional benefits of fostering job creation and improving air quality and human health. These benefits are especially important to the disadvantaged communities and households throughout the state. Along these lines, Cal EPA worked with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment to develop and use Cal EnviroScreen, a tool that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that identified disadvantaged communities by scoring every census tract in the state according to aggregated statewide environmental, population, and health data. Cal EnviroScreen allows us to meet the direction of SB 535 and apportion greenhouse gas reduction fund monies to those most impacted communities, according to what SB 535 directed us to do. Along with the ARB, Cal EPA developed guidelines for determining those program benefits to and in disadvantaged communities. ARB and Cal EPA co-led facilitated workshops in Oakland, Fresno, and Los Angeles. Nearly 500 people attended the workshops for these guidelines, and more submitted written comments. ARB is working on the next phase of the guidelines and will return to the public for comment later this spring with a final approach out this summer. These investments and policies set the stage for transformation in California's transportation sector. The governor's State of the State goals provide an opportunity to push our progress even further. So in January, the governor highlighted 5 key points for us to pursue in moving beyond 2020. Reduce today's petroleum use in cars and trucks by up to 50%, increase the portion of electricity generated using renewables to 50%, double the energy efficiency achieved in existing buildings and make heating fuels cleaner, reduce emissions of methane, black carbon, and other potent climate pollutants across all industries, and manage farms and rangelands, forests and wetlands so that they can store carbon. So in these goals is evident a very strong role for transportation. We can build on existing policies and programs to reach the governor's goals and augment the impacts of policies on sustainable communities, vehicle emissions, electrification of transport, and cleaner fuels. Finally, in addition to addressing climate change in the transportation sector here at home, we're leading the world. California's greenhouse gas tailpipe standards became the model for the US national standard. We have key partnerships in the 8-state zero-emission vehicle memorandum of understanding that Governor Brown signed in the fall of 2013. Last fall, these 8 states, Connecticut, California, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Vermont, announced more than 250,000 zero-emission vehicles on the road, on our way to a collective target of 3.3 million by 2025. So we're also working with the Pacific Coast Collaborative, and that's Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, on the West Coast Electric Highway and the West Coast Electric Fleets Pledge. We'll continue working with leadership jurisdictions globally to share our experiences and learn from others and on many aspects of clean transportation. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you. We'll turn it over to Kate White and then open it up for questions. Kate, welcome.
Great, thank you so
California
much.
Transportation Agency.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members. Yes, I'm Kate White, Deputy Secretary for Environmental Policy and Housing Coordination at the State Transportation Agency. Later in your agenda, you have Undersecretary Brian Annis, who's going to be available, both of us, through the hearing to answer any of your questions. He will be drilling down a little bit more on the 2 transit programs, operations and capital transit programs that the Transportation Agency is managing through the cap and trade proceeds. But thank you, Senator Beal and Senator Wachowski, for inviting the Transportation Agency here today to talk about this very important topic of reducing emissions in the transportation sector to meet the state's climate goals. Now, you had sent us 4 questions, and I'm going to address all 4 of those. Specifically, 1, what changes must take place in the transportation sector, both behavioral and technological, to meet the state's climate goals? 2, how is the agency working to help transform the transportation sector to meet these challenges? 3, how is the agency working with other agencies to meet the state's climate goals? And finally, the role of the agency in implementing 535 de Leon of 2012 to address environmental justice issues related to the transportation sector. So I will provide an overview of each of these 4 questions, and as I said later in the hearing, Undersecretary Brian Annis will drill down on the 2 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund transit programs. So first, your first question, what changes must take place in the transportation sector, both behavioral and technological, in order to meet the state's climate goals? At the Transportation Agency, we are acutely aware of what you opened with, that we represent the transportation sector, a very large source of GHG emissions. If you count in things like fuel refining and oil extraction, it's all the way to more like 50% of GHG emissions to support California's massive vehicle fleet. So to stabilize climate, the ultimate goal of California's climate programs, of course, will require transforming the transportation sector in three main areas: cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels, and I'm going to leave it to my colleagues at CEC and at the ARB to really focus on those. But thirdly, improved transit, active transportation, and land use to reduce reliance on single occupant car trips. So the Caltrans draft California Transportation Plan 2040, which is right now in its 5-day comment period through April 17th, was crafted in partnership with other agencies, local governments, businesses, and environmental stakeholders. And this California Transportation Plan 2040 is the first such statewide plan drafted under Senate Bill 391 Lieu, which requires that this plan actually show how the state will achieve statewide emission reductions to stabilize climate consistent with the goals of AB 32. And this is expressed as reducing GHG emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. In response, for the first time, the California Transportation Plan is analyzing scenarios within the plan. And so there's three scenarios that we have modeled. The first scenario basically rolls up the Metropolitan Planning Organization's regional transportation plans and it assumes the current mix of vehicle and fuel types. Well, this first scenario doesn't get us too far. It's fairly minor reductions in the longer haul when you look forward to 2040. Scenario 2 additionally models a package of reduction strategies, basically policy proposals including pricing, operational efficiencies, increasing transportation alternatives, all resulting in mode shift away from single occupant vehicle trips. This scenario gets us to about 25% reductions by 2050. Then scenario 3 assumes all of the above, so the regional transportation plan, sustainable community strategies, plus the package of strategies I mentioned, plus an aggressive vehicle fleet mix from ARB's vision model. So when you put all of these three things together in scenario 3, do we meet our 80% below by 2050? So the CTP, the California Transportation Plan modeling, illuminates that we basically have to employ multiple strategies, both behavioral, technological, infrastructure, to meet the target. So technological solutions of cleaner cars and cleaner fuels is critically important, and that is why we support Cal EPA and ARB on strategies such as fuel standards and caps on carbon. However, our focus at the Transportation Agency is on the infrastructure and behavioral side of the coin, and that is improving transit, biking, walking, and land use to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So that leads me to your second question, which is what are we doing to meet these challenges? So we're working on many fronts to help transform the transportation sector to meet 21st century climate challenges. We're deploying strategies to serve every level of traveler, from longer interregional trips to shorter local trips to neighborhood access. And so I'll briefly mention three strategies. Of course, number one, we're building high-speed rail, and we see high-speed rail as a cornerstone of electrifying transportation in California. The Menendez Institute recently published a report on mode shift in Europe and Asia, and they found that particularly on those trips 100 to 600 miles, high-speed rail is extremely competitive with the automobile, and equally, if not more important, with air traffic, which is, so far you can't electrify planes. So if we can replace those very dirty air trips, we're making a good dent in carbon reduction. In both European and Asian countries where high-speed rail has been deployed, air service for specific trips were reduced or even curtailed altogether. And so we expect the same results here in California between the Bay Area and the LA region, where 1 out of every 4 trips coming out of the Bay Area is going to the LA region. And that's a lot of trips that really, we expect that to cut in half with high-speed rail in place. And while we've already commenced construction, as you know, in the initial operating segment in Central Valley, high-speed rail is also making both Northern California and Southern California infrastructure investments, connectivity projects. We're electrifying Caltrain. That will double their capacity out on a system that, as you probably know, is really at capacity, very popular line, as well as other local improvements like in LA Union Station. And I should note that the state is actually already today and for many years been serving over 5 million annual interregional passengers through our 3 rail lines, Capital Corridor, San Joaquin, and the Pacific Surfliner. With the state's contribution, ongoing contribution of about $120 million annually, these 3 lines represent 3 of the 5 busiest Amtrak corridors in the country and include a thorough network of bus throughway service that stretches to every corner of the state. So that leads me to let's see, your third question, how are we working with other states to meet the climate goals? Let me just mention first a couple other things that we're doing before we get into partnerships. We're working on supporting local transit. Especially for those mid-distance trips, 5 to 100 miles, the state transit account this past year was $1 billion. It's been several $100 million every year that we're supporting local transit operators. Also, for trips that are less than a mile, which actually represents about 30% of trips in California, many of them, unfortunately, still made by automobile. Last year, we launched, the California Transportation Commission and Caltrans launched the very popular Active Transportation Program. And our active transportation program is investing in projects to make inviting, safe walking and biking the default for these shorter trips, under 1 mile trips. So mode shift to active transportation not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but of course has many co-benefits. You mentioned health, Senator Wachowski at the beginning, very important in terms of healthier lifestyles for children and families, being able to get safe routes to schools, for example. And so, smart land use, of course, has to be, I know this is a transportation hearing, but smart land uses has to be included as well. And then finally, we are really looking at every opportunity to set new mission and goals for our departments so that they're aligned with the state's climate goals. So that leads to your third question, how are we working with other agencies? We have a number of very deep partnerships and collaborations with our colleagues. Secretary Kelly serves on the Strategic Growth Council. I serve as key staff. So these 7 agencies and dozens of departments, we meet every other week to collaborate on strategies to address the state's planning priorities. Also, in addition, per SB 1039, Steinberg's bill, called for Secretary Kelly and the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, Secretary Ana Caballero, to co-chair our Housing and Transportation Coordination Work Group, and we're meeting across 3 transportation departments and 2 housing departments. I convene this work group every month with Deputy Secretary for Housing Policy, Susan Riggs. And further, we are part of the CAT, the Climate Action Team, Cal EPA's Climate Action Team. And then in terms of specific efforts to meet the state's climate goals with our other sister agencies and departments, Caltrans Director Malcolm Doherty convenes a monthly meeting with OPR on implementing SB 743, which calls for really institutionalizing this reduced vehicle miles travel as our new metrics for traffic analysis. We're also working very closely with ARB, of course, on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund programs. And then finally, we're working collaboratively also with ARB on the joint sustainable freight strategy, which is focused on the heavy-duty vehicles and enhancing competitiveness of California. So your final question was the role of our agency in implementing SB 535 to address environmental justice issues related to the transportation sector. Brian Annis will discuss our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund transit programs, provisions for benefiting disadvantaged communities. Those programs have targets of 25% and 50% of benefiting disadvantaged communities. But I also want to mention another example of how SB 535 is influencing policy even beyond cap and trade. And that is, again, our active transportation program. The application, even before the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund expenditure plan was approved last June, we asked applicants to discuss how their projects would benefit disadvantaged communities. And I'm pleased to report that of the first round of funds, active transportation funds that went out, 83% of the grants are benefiting disadvantaged communities. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I hope this provided an understanding of the agency's serious commitment and work on multiple fronts to address the challenge of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you both secretaries for coming in and giving us this overview. And in terms of questions, let's talk about electric vehicles. What kind of, you think the consumer incentives match our strategic goals? Our strategic goals are pretty bold.
Right.
In terms of electric vehicles. And the question is our policies and our programs match the strategic goals?
Got it. Well, I think Richard Corey will address the low-emission vehicle program, and so he'll be able to talk about the match between demand for those rebates and supply in the low-emission vehicle program. And I think also the Energy Commission will discuss some of that as well. But so I won't opine on whether or not they match, but I do think we have a number of policies in place to try to match demand for ZEVs in the state right now. And I think it's a longer-term goal to set the infrastructure in place and ensure that everyone who wants an electric vehicle up and down the state has an opportunity to get that.
Is another goal, if we want to talk about strategy, because you're the overview group, so a strategic perspective, is the mindset of consumers towards what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Can you address that in terms of a strategic goal regarding changing the mindsets?
I can speak
how people think about
to one thing regarding
AB
that.
32.
In terms of the mode shift that we're already seeing, the California state travel model between 2000 and 2010, we actually saw a doubling of both walking, biking, and transit trips as a percentage of trips statewide. And that was before putting in a tremendous amount of infrastructure. So I think you're seeing the demand for these modes rising, doubling over the last decade. And I think in many ways, Gen Y is kind of leading the way, younger than any of us. But they're not even getting their driver's license. They'd rather be on their phones than drive behind the wheel, and you're not supposed to do both, of course. And so we're seeing a real sea change in terms of the transportation demand and what modes certainly the next generation is looking for.
Yeah, and I think the transit industry always struggles with how to get people to shift.
Right.
It's been very difficult for the industry as a whole
And along
over the years, and I think that's a major challenge that we're going to have, I think.
Along those lines, I do think, an educational strategy, more communications is always helpful. And so our workshops out in the public, we're trying to get out of Sacramento and go as many places in the state as possible. That helps us do some of the education, but it's clearly more is necessary in order to make this transformation happen.
Senator Wachowski.
And there's a lot of ways that transportation and environmental quality intersect. Air quality is the simple one that comes to us. But there's other important considerations. For instance, certain types of alternative vehicles that may reduce our emissions also beat up our roads. And then we have to send out diesel spewing truck and equipment to fix that up. And that will raise emissions over time. Can you talk about how the agencies are working to, are these effects being considered? And how can we sort through those issues?
Sure. We have a new assistant director for sustainability at Caltrans, because that's where many of the vehicles you're talking about, I think we own them. And Steve Cliff joined us. We stole him from ARB. And he's a climate scientist and is looking at sustainability from all different perspectives, but including the operation of Caltrans and making sure that we have in the proposed budget, governor's proposed budget, to switch over at least the first or good chunk of Caltrans vehicles over to cleaner vehicles. So I think we're looking for every opportunity that we can clean up our act internally as well.
And I would add that I think our approaches all provide a variety of options for people in the state. So it wouldn't be that just cars are having to beat up the roads. We also have options for people to walk, take active transit, mass transit. So people could eventually leave their cars if that's one of the options that they can pursue. So I think we're trying to address all of that by increasing options for Californians.
I guess my next question would be, how are we working to make gains to continue the connectivity of our transit lines? I mean, I know in my town of Fremont, we have, always pains me, we have where the Capitol Corridor and the ACE train from San Joaquin, and I guess if there was a Dumbarton corridor to connect in the BART, there's no transit station there. I think the Europeans and the Asian market would say, how do you not have a connectivity station there? And it just seems like it's not the Bob Wykowski show. It should be the interagency. Other people should look at the map and do that. And I guess how are we protecting our health and in other parts of the state on this connectivity, our connectivity goals, I guess?